There was a time when Libra stepped into love with all the sincerity you had. You believed love meant learning to yield, taking one step back to keep the peace, staying silent when you wanted to speak, smiling even when there were waves inside your heart. You didn't call that sacrifice. You called it love. And you did it naturally, the same way you've always searched for balance in every part of your life. But as time passed, there were evenings that felt endlessly long. Moments when you sat alone, the room so quiet you could hear your own breathing, and something unfamiliar surfaced. Your heart was tired. Not tired because love was missing, but tired because it had grown used to holding itself together, used to being strong, used to enduring more than it ever should have had to. Libra, you've never been someone who doesn't feel pain. You feel it deeply, but you once believed that if you were patient enough, gentle enough, understanding enough, everything would eventually be okay. You thought love was like a scale, that if you leaned just a little more, balance could always be restored. Yet some pain doesn't disappear through effort. It simply repeats itself, quietly, day after day, until the heart no longer reacts sharply and is left only with emptiness. And it was inside that emptiness that a small light began to appear. Not bright, not loud, just a quiet question rising from within. Why does love have to hurt this much? Why does my peace always come last? Why am I always the one who understands, who makes room, who waits? That moment wasn't about giving up on love. It was the moment you began to see love through different eyes. You realized that racing heartbeats, constant anxiety, sleepless nights are not proof of depth. Sometimes they're simply signs that you've wandered too far away from yourself. Libra began to understand that love shouldn't feel like a silent battle inside the chest. Love isn't about endlessly reshaping yourself to fit someone else until you forget what you once looked like. Love isn't walking on eggshells with every word, every feeling, afraid that being yourself might make everything fall apart. This awakening arrived gently. It didn't break you. It only asked you to pause and listen to your body, to pause and notice that your heart was asking for something very simple: safety, rest, love without shrinking. At the time, you may not have had words for what was changing. You only knew that you no longer wanted to trade your peace for the sake of holding on to a relationship. You began to respect your exhaustion instead of judging it. And in that respect, a deeply human truth was born. No one needs to suffer to prove they love enough. Libra, the world has grown used to seeing you as the mediator, the one who softens conflict, the one who stands in the middle to keep things balanced. But perhaps it's time you receive that same gentleness from life itself, and from the relationships you choose to stay in. When you allow yourself to pause, not to close your heart, but to listen to it more deeply, you begin to realize this tiredness isn't an ending. It's a whisper guiding you toward a different way of loving, slower, more honest, beginning with yourself. And as you sit within that moment, inside a silence that feels fragile yet real, something inside you quietly shifts. Not to move away from love, but to prepare for a kind of love that no longer requires endurance. A place where your heart can breathe evenly again, and where the emotions long left behind are finally called home, softly, with kindness. At first, they appeared very softly, like a breeze passing through the mind at the end of the day, when every role has finally been set down. You begin to realize just how used to listening you've become, used to sitting quietly, nodding, understanding, accepting, used to placing other people's stories first, while saving your own for later, always thinking you'll speak when the time is right. But that later, somewhere along the way, turned into a long stretch of silence. Libra was born with an unusually fine sensitivity. You hear what others haven't yet said. You feel the emotions they're still hiding, and you stay there, gently, patiently, long enough for them to feel safe. But in that process, there are moments when you swallow your own words, moments when you know you're sad, when you know you're hurting, yet you choose silence because you don't want to disturb the fragile calm you've worked so hard to preserve. That silence is never loud. It doesn't draw blame. It doesn't create conflict. It simply accumulates slowly, like fine dust in the air, until one day you notice you're no longer breathing as deeply as before. You still smile. You still show up. You're still the one everyone turns to when they need to talk. But inside, a part of you begins to retreat, to grow smaller, as if you're trying not to take up too much space. You once believed this was maturity, that loving meant learning to place the ego a little lower. And yes, there is beauty in that. But there is a delicate line between love and self-erasure. When you always choose we and forget I, the heart slowly learns to stand in the background, watching other people's happiness, without ever asking if it too is okay. Not because Libra is weak. On the contrary, you are far stronger than you realize. You've simply been loyal to other people's emotions for too long. You believed that if they were okay, if the relationship was peaceful, your own exhaustion could be set aside. You trusted that love, if it were big enough, would heal everything on its own. But some things do not heal unless they are seen. And then, somewhere along that quiet journey, there comes an ordinary evening. No drama. No arguments, no tears. Just you, sitting there, suddenly realizing you haven't asked yourself a very simple question in a long time. How do I feel? That question carries no blame. It arrives gently, like a reminder that you also exist in this story. When you begin to allow yourself to feel again, the emotions you've held back don't burst out violently. They simply show up. A little sadness that was never spoken. A little fatigue that never rested. A quiet loneliness, even while being with someone. And instead of pushing them away, for the first time, you stay with them. Just one breath longer. In that moment, something essential begins to shift. You no longer feel ashamed of needing to be heard. You no longer see placing yourself at the center of your own emotions as selfish. You understand that if your heart is continually neglected, sooner or later, every balance you work so hard to maintain will tilt. This silence is different now. It's no longer suppression. It becomes a conscious pause, a space where you slowly return to yourself, slow enough to hear even the smallest inner vibrations. And when you allow this to happen, you don't lose love. You're preparing for a fairer way of loving, one where the tenderness you give has a path back to you, touching you again, warm, and finally, whole. And then, as gentleness slowly returns to yourself, Libra begins to notice something else, deeper, quieter, yet impossible to ignore. Some pains are not new. They carry a familiar shape, so familiar you can recognize them within just a few heartbeats, not because the person in front of you resembles someone from the past, but because the feeling inside you repeats almost exactly the same way, still waiting, still holding on to the fragile hope that this time things will be different, still believing that if you love enough, if you are patient enough, if you are generous enough, one day the door to that heart will finally open. But as time moves on, Libra begins to realize that this pain is no longer tied to a single face. It feels like an old road, one you've walked many times before, with the same familiar ending. You love people who aren't ready to stay. You place your heart into the hands of those who are still running from their own emotions. And you remain there, waiting for them to understand, waiting for them to grow, waiting for them to choose you the way you chose them long ago. This waiting is never loud. It lives inside messages that go unanswered for too long, inside promises that are never fully kept, inside the quiet habit of telling yourself they just need more time. But deep within, there is a part of you that already knows the truth. It's not that they don't care about you, it's that they cannot love in the way you need, and that doesn't make them bad. It simply turns the relationship into a place where you are always enduring more than you are being nourished. Libra begins to look back and see a very clear pattern. Each time you love, you become the one who keeps the rhythm, the one who balances, the one who stands in the middle so everything doesn't collapse. But love is not a bridge meant to be held up from only one side. When you are the only one trying to keep everything standing, exhaustion is not a weakness. It is a signal that you've gone too far in trading away yourself. There comes a moment that truly matters, a moment when you stop asking why they won't change and begin asking why you continue to stay. That question carries no judgment. It simply opens the door to a very clear truth. Pain that repeats itself no longer needs explanation. It needs recognition. And when you find the courage to look directly at it, you understand something essential. Love is not measured by how much you can endure, There is no reward for staying in relationships that repeatedly wound you. If love always arrives with anxiety, with constant unease, with doubt about your own worth, that is not depth. It is a lesson knocking, again and again, until you are ready to listen. Libra, this lesson did not come to blame you. It came to free you. To remind you that you were not born to play the role of someone who waits without an end. You were born to be chosen, clearly, calmly, without having to beg. When you truly understand that, pain loses its grip on you. It steps back, making room for a very gentle clarity. And inside that clarity, you begin to feel a shift, small but unmistakably real. You no longer want to reshape someone to fit your life. You no longer want to sacrifice your peace to hold on to a relationship that was never truly ready. Your heart begins to close old doors, not out of coldness, but because you've learned to tell the difference between love and a lesson. As this settles, a strange feeling appears, lighter, clearer, as if you've stepped out of a familiar loop, paused for a moment, and finally taken a breath. And within that breath, Libra begins to sense a very quiet pull, not toward searching for love right away, but toward asking something deeper. If love no longer has to hurt, then what should the love of your future be built upon? And that question, soft and steady, is where everything truly begins to change. And when that question lingers in your heart long enough, Libra begins to understand something quietly profound. There are doors that do not need another explanation to be closed. Not because things have become terrible, not because someone was wrong, or because you were right. Simply because peace has already left, slipping away at some point, leaving behind a space that is difficult to name. For a long time, Libra carried an invisible pressure, the pressure to have a clear reason, to explain things neatly, to prove that you tried long enough, hard enough, deep enough. As if only when everything was placed on a perfectly balanced scale would leaving a finally make sense. But the more life you live, the more a very gentle truth becomes clear. The heart does not need paperwork. It only needs to be heard. There are mornings when you wake up already feeling heavy on the first breath. No arguments, no dramatic events. Just a dull exhaustion, as if your soul is wearing a coat that has grown too tight. You can still wear it, but it no longer allows you to move freely. And in that moment, you understand something important. You do not have to wait for everything to collapse to give yourself permission to stop. Libra once stayed out of fear of hurting others, fear of breaking harmony, fear of being the one who leaves first. But rarely did you ask who would protect you as you slowly disappeared in the effort to keep everything intact. The truth is, not everyone has the ability to see your exhaustion, especially when you've become so skilled at hiding it behind gentleness. Letting go at this stage does not come with dramatic tears. It happens quietly, the way a soft wind releases a dry leaf. No one is wrong, no one loses. You simply no longer have enough room to breathe in that relationship. And for the first time, you allow that to be reason enough. When you stop trying to explain your decision to everyone, something unexpected appears. Relief. Not because you have become indifferent, but because you have stopped betraying your own emotions. You understand that leaving does not erase what once existed. It is simply a way of honoring the truth of the present moment. There is something deeply human about this moment. Choosing yourself without justification. Allowing yourself to step out of old patterns where love was always paired with silent sacrifice. You begin to see that peace is not a reward for those who endure the most. It is a basic right of a heart that knows how to care for itself. Libra, when you close an old cycle, you are not shutting your heart. You are only closing paths that required you to shrink in order to fit. And as you stand still inside that just enough quiet, your breathing begins to deepen. Your body begins to soften. Your thoughts stop running in circles. You don't need everyone to understand this journey. Some decisions only require one person's agreement, and that person is you. When you allow yourself to leave without carrying guilt, you open a new space inside, a space where the heart no longer has to stay guarded, where emotions no longer have to be compressed, where life begins to move again, slowly but steadily. And it is in that very real lightness that you realize this letting go has taken nothing valuable from you. On the contrary, it has returned something that was forgotten long ago, the right to breathe lightly, the right to live a life where each step forward is no longer heavy from carrying what is already asked to be set down. And then, when everything has finally been set down gently enough, a space opens. Not a space of loss, but a rare quiet that Libra hasn't touched in a long time. At first it feels unfamiliar. There is no longer the noise of expectations. No longer the hovering questions waiting to be answered for someone else. There is only your own breath, steadier, deeper. As if your body has finally been given permission to rest after a long journey. Inside that quiet, you begin to notice the smallest things again. The way your shoulders soften when they no longer have to tense to hold an entire relationship in balance. The way your heart slows when it no longer has to guess what someone else might be thinking. The way your mind stops spinning when you no longer have to convince yourself that everything will somehow be okay. This is not escape. This is return. Slow enough for you to realize just how long you had been neglecting yourself. There are evenings now when you are alone and no longer feel empty. No need to fill the silence with messages, with noise, with someone else's presence. You begin to understand that the loneliness you once felt did not come from being alone, but from being with others while not being allowed to be yourself. And when that changes, your private space becomes safe, a place where you can listen to what your body needs, to what your heart is saying, without reshaping yourself to fit anyone else. Libra has always had a finely tuned intuition, but for a long time, you learned to ignore it. You were used to prioritizing harmony, used to rationalizing the very real signals rising from within. Now, as everything settles, that intuition begins to speak again. Not harshly, not urgently, just with quiet clarity. What feels light? What feels heavy? What makes you contract? What allows you to open? You begin to love yourself differently. Not through grand declarations, but through very small choices, allowing yourself to rest when you're tired, saying no when it matters, not over-explaining decisions that protect your peace. You realize that caring for yourself does not make you selfish. It makes you honest, healthier, more whole for the love you may offer in the future. This space carries a special kind of beauty. It does not rush to be filled. It does not demand that you be ready for something new right away. It simply invites you to stay a little longer, to feel balance quietly returning, like a scale that has tilted too many times, finally finding its still point. And in that moment, you understand something deeply true. Your nature was never meant to endure. Your nature is harmony, fairness, the ability to love without losing yourself. A quiet maturity is unfolding. You no longer need to prove that you are strong. You no longer need to hide moments of softness. You allow yourself to be human, with real emotions, clear boundaries, honest needs. And that permission brings a new kind of energy, gentle yet grounded. Libra begins to see that when pain is no longer at the center, other things have room to appear: clarity, self-respect, and a quiet trust that you deserve relationships that do not require you to brace yourself to survive them. This space is not passive waiting. It is inner preparation, a place where you rebalance how you give and how you receive. And as you sit inside it, with peace slowly becoming familiar, something very subtle arrives, like morning light touching a freshly cleared room. Not blinding, but enough to help you see more clearly. Clearer about what you need. Clearer about what you will no longer accept. Clearer about how a healthy connection should actually feel. In that steady breathing, in that deep listening, Libra's heart begins to open in a new way. Not rushed, not expectant, just honest. And that honesty is quietly reshaping how you will step into love from here on. No longer through endurance, but through safety. No longer through silent sacrifice, but through full presence. And when you allow yourself to remain in this balanced state long enough, a new definition of love slowly takes form. Gentle, clear, and no longer painful. And within that quiet that has slowly become familiar, Libra begins to notice a subtle shift in the way the heart responds to the very idea of love. There is no longer that restless urge to hold on, no longer the racing pulse driven by fear of loss. In its place comes a gentle calm, like stepping into a room filled with natural light, where everything is already in its rightful place, and nothing needs to be rearranged. In this new understanding, love no longer depends on grand promises or dramatic gestures. It doesn't arrive to overwhelm you. It arrives to steady you, No checking, no constant watching, no pressure to explain yourself again and again. You don't have to prove that you are worthy of love. Your presence alone, simply being who you are, is enough. Libra begins to understand that healthy love does not require you to shrink yourself to fit someone else. It doesn't ask you to constantly adjust your emotions to avoid friction. This new love allows you to breathe evenly, to speak honestly, to remain fully yourself without fear of being left behind. It doesn't measure how much you've sacrificed. It asks something much simpler. Are you okay? There is a clear difference now in the way love feels in your body. Before, love often carried a subtle tension, as if you always needed to be prepared for something to go wrong. Now, when you think about a true connection, your body no longer tightens. Instead, you feel yourself opening, slowly and naturally, like a door that no longer needs to be locked. This new love does not control. It doesn't need to track every step you take to feel secure. It respects personal space, necessary silence, and even the days when you simply want to be alone. And within that respect, a deeper kind of bond forms. One that isn't built on fear of losing each other, but on the choice to stay. Libra realizes that when love is no longer built on insecurity, it becomes incredibly light like breath. Something you don't have to think about, yet is always there, quietly nourishing each moment. You no longer wonder if you're doing enough. You no longer guess whether your feelings will be returned. Everything feels clear, transparent. There is nothing left to decode. A very particular sense of safety emerges as you stand before this new definition. The safety of being yourself without fear of judgment, of expressing your needs without worrying about being a burden, of choosing silence when you need it without being misunderstood. Love no longer tests your patience. It becomes a resting place for the soul. Libra also begins to see love as a shared space, where two people walk side by side, not one pulling the other along. No one has to chase. No one stays out of obligation. Only a willing companionship, where each person stands firmly on their own feet. In this new definition, love doesn't arrive to fill unhealed emptiness. It comes when you already know how to care for yourself. It doesn't heal you for you. It walks beside you, respecting the boundaries and values you've learned over time. And because of that, it doesn't need to be loud to prove that it exists. When Libra allows the heart to remain in this feeling long enough, a very quiet trust begins to form. That true love does not confuse you about your worth. It does not make you doubt your intuition. It does not ask you to trade your peace just to hold on. It simply stays. Steady, warm, like a hand reaching for yours at exactly the right moment. Not gripping too tightly, not letting go. Just enough to remind you that you are not alone. And within that sense of safety, your heart begins to beat differently, slower, deeper, more honest. No longer the rhythm of anxiety, but the rhythm of trust. And when you realize that you can love without losing yourself, you understand that what is forming is not just a new relationship, but a new way of living. A way where love is no longer fear, but a place you are allowed to stay, fully present, whole, and at peace. And when that sense of safety stays in your heart long enough, something very natural begins to happen. Libra's heart no longer feels the need to stay on guard. It no longer tightens when facing a new connection. And it no longer rushes forward out of fear of missing something. Instead, a very different state appears, quiet yet clear, like the surface of a lake after the wind has passed. You begin to hear subtle signals that were once drowned out by anxiety and longing. Your intuition never disappeared. It only went quiet when you kept doubting yourself. Now, with pain no longer standing at the center, that intuition returns in a gentle way. It doesn't command, it doesn't push. It simply shows you what allows you to open and what asks you to close. You don't need to analyze too much. Your body knows, your heart knows, and you begin to trust that. A soft clarity is now present. You no longer love with the hope that someone will change. You no longer love to fill an old emptiness. When a connection appears, you don't ask whether it's intense enough. You ask whether it feels safe enough for you to be yourself. You understand that love does not need to steal your sleep, take away your sense of direction, or make you question your worth. If something consistently leaves you feeling uneasy, your intuition gently touches you, reminding you this is not your path. Libra begins to know how to pause without feeling guilty. Not because you've grown colder, but because you've grown more honest. You understand that not every open door needs to be walked through. Not every feeling that arrives needs to be pursued. Sometimes, the greatest respect you can give yourself is to take one step back, observe, and allow the truth to reveal itself in time. You also know when to open your heart, no longer wide open out of longing, but just enough when safety is present, when words match actions, when care doesn't require guessing, when you don't have to shrink yourself in order to stay. In those moments, you feel something very clearly. Your heart is in the right place, not tense, not anxious, not defensive. There is a deep beauty in this kind of clarity. It doesn't make you hardened. On the contrary, it gives your gentleness a boundary. You remain warm. You still listen deeply. You still love with all your natural sensitivity, but you no longer place yourself in positions that require endurance just to preserve someone else's feelings. You choose connections that respect your rhythm. And you respect yourself enough to walk away when something no longer aligns. Libra, society often teaches us that love means pushing through, never giving up. But there is a vital human truth you are relearning now. Love also means knowing when to stop, knowing how to listen when intuition says this is not where you can bloom. And that does not make you a failure, it makes you mature. When you live with respect for yourself, you send a powerful message outward that love does not need pain to be real, that safety is the foundation, not the reward, that every person deserves to be loved in a space that does not demand the sacrifice of peace. Guided quietly by intuition, your steps begin to change, slower, steadier, no longer pulled by fear of loss, but led by inner clarity. Your heart does not close now. It opens selectively, with the trust that what truly fits will never need to be fought for. As you continue moving in this new rhythm, a warm feeling begins to settle in, as if every past experience, both painful and healing, has fulfilled its purpose. They have led you here to a place where you know how to love without betraying yourself. And within that quiet strength, something becomes clear. When love no longer hurts you, it doesn't just guide the heart. It opens a true place of return, a place where you are allowed to stay, where you are chosen, and where you are loved fully and whole. And then, within all that stillness, something very simple happens. No fireworks, no declarations, just a quiet realization that your heart is no longer tensed for defense. It is no longer bracing for pain, no longer restless from the fear of losing. It simply rests there, calm, warm, as if, after a very long journey, it has finally found its natural rhythm again. When love no longer hurts you, you begin to feel it in an entirely different way. It no longer feels like a test of how patient you can be, or how much you're willing to sacrifice. It doesn't ask you to prove anything. It doesn't require you to become smaller, quieter, or more agreeable just to be allowed to stay. Love now feels like a familiar space, a place you can step into without leaving parts of yourself at the door. Libra comes to understand something deeply important. True love does not arrive to disrupt your life. It arrives to steady it, not through control, but through a profound sense of safety. You no longer have to wonder if you are loved today. You no longer fear that speaking your truth will change everything. In this love, your presence is enough. There is great beauty in the feeling of coming home to yourself while being with another, coming home to peace within shared space, coming home to the knowing that you no longer need to run or chase. Love is no longer a place where your energy is drained. It becomes a place where you are restored, supported, where you can breathe deeply without worrying about disturbing anyone. Libra understands now that the pains of the past were not mistakes. They were steps that led you here. Each wound taught you about boundaries. Each disappointment taught you about your worth. And when you gather those lessons, not to defend yourself, but to live more honestly, love begins to appear in a very different form. Real love does not need pain to prove that it is real. It does not need jealousy, anxiety, or self-doubt. It does not test you through confusion. It does not place you in endless waiting. Real love chooses you clearly, stays willingly, and respects you enough not to harm you. In this understanding, Libra begins to see love as a long journey shared, not a violent wave to survive. two people walking side by side, each grounded in themselves, yet close enough to share warmth. No one has to strain to hold on. No one fears being left for being who they truly are. There is a deeply human message here, not only for Libra, but for anyone who has ever loved through endurance. Peace is not a luxury. It is the foundation. Being loved should not feel like an inner battle. It should feel like a place of rest after everything life has placed on your shoulders. And when you allow love to exist this way, you also help reshape how society understands love. No longer glorifying blind sacrifice, no longer romanticizing pain, but honoring healthy connections, where people grow together instead of wearing each other down. Libra, if you are standing here now, in this moment where your heart no longer hurts, trust this. You have not lost anything. You have found yourself again. And from that place, love is no longer something you chase through anxiety. It becomes something you allow to enter when it arrives with safety, respect, and the peace you deserve. When love is allowed to stay this way, quiet, unforced, without needing proof, it becomes more than a relationship. It becomes a spiritual home, a place you can return to after everything, where burdens can be set down, and where you know you were loved, not for how much you endured, but simply for being who you are. And that is where true love finally begins.